Welcome to World Affairs Today, brought to you by the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C., a leading forum for global education and international affairs.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. My name is Tony Cully-Foster. I have the pleasure of being the President and CEO of the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. As you can hear from my speech impediment, I'm of the United States at the moment, but I'm not from the United States. I am from Ireland, that northwest part of Ireland that has seen its fair share of violence over the last 50 years. Thankfully, with the help of the United States and the Clinton administration in particular, and George Mitchell and others who intervened on the American side, we have peace in Ireland. I wish I could say we had peace in a lot of the other areas of the world we're going to talk about tonight. Unfortunately, we don't. I'm very pleased to see such a large gathering come out tonight, because blessed are the peacemakers, they shall inherit the earth. Peace, peace, peace. How to get there. One of the challenges I think this panel is going to have to address tonight is, how does anyone deal with an organized, well-equipped, media-savvy, intelligent, globalized group that occupies as a caliphate a stretch of territory bigger than many countries in the world. The word whack-a-mole has been used by a lot of people in the Congress and the administration to try and express their despair at the fact that where it looks like things have been settled in one area, within 30 days, another big problem area pops up. So how do we deal with this in the 21st century when we've got people who are not only media savage and media savvy, but who know the fact that the United States and other allied nations really don't have a cohesive, coordinated solution to what has become one of the major terrorism challenges in the early part of this 21st century. What is it that motivates people from the United States, United Kingdom, countries of Europe, to volunteer to serve in this group called ISIL? I was at an iftar dinner last night. It was an interfaith dinner. We had all the major religions represented in that group. The harmony, the desire for peace was palpable in the room. The work that people were doing in an interfaith way to try and talk sense, first of all, to themselves and then to each other, about how collectively that they might get together to combat ISIL, was for me very humbling. I'm not sure what this panel is going to come out with tonight, but I do know one thing. Each of you have got their biographies in front of you. We're very fortunate to have a very savvy, educated, globalist group here tonight. And it's my hope that our moderator, Brian Bender, is going to live up to his reputation and make sure that we get answers to the questions that will be asked here tonight, as much as our two distinguished speakers, Thomas Sanderson and Dr. Shadi Hamid, will be able to provide. The World Affairs Council is dedicated to 3 pillars of learning: global education, international affairs, and global communications. Our work is with teachers, high school teachers and undergraduate teachers in university. We're in the knowledge transfer business. We want to empower people, not through giving them knowledge, but by showing them how to put it into action to produce the desired results. And a mastermind alliance is what we need to combat terrorism. That's 2 or more entities working in harmony towards a common goal. Produces a force greater than 1 + 1 = 2. Our ethos at the World Affairs Council is we're an institution where learning happens. So I'm depending upon Brian, Thomas, and Shadi tonight to help us advance that ethos. And please, as an audience, do not be shy about standing up, speaking out, asking incisive questions, because our panelists and our moderator will ensure to the best of their ability that you'll get them. So without any further ado, I'd like to turn this over to Brian Bender and wish him bon voyage for about an hour. And I hope that out of this tonight will come a lot of enlightenment and a lot of education about probably the most serious terrorist challenge that our world has seen for more than 50 years. Brian.
Well, thanks very much for having me and having us. Maybe my role is best suited to doing a very quick, what I would call sort of ISIS backdrop, or ISIL backdrop, whatever your preference is, and then open it up to the 2 real experts who can give their perspective, and then we'll open it for questions. When I was thinking about the backdrop here, I had a couple of big picture thoughts. One is a nearly 4-year civil war in Syria. A government in Baghdad and Iraq that most people would consider very sectarian, led by Shia Muslims with a Sunni population of significant size feeling disenfranchised. By definition, a refugee problem that I think we're going to hear about. That used to get a lot more attention, it seems to me. It doesn't get as much attention now, maybe because we've gotten used to the humanitarian crisis that exists in this part of the world. Obviously, a bigger struggle in the region between Shia Iran and some of its clients, including the Syrian regime, and the Sunni-led governments of the Gulf, which are ostensibly our allies. A 10-month-old US-led air war that began in Iraq and is now been going on in Syria as well for many months to try and beat back the advances of the Islamic State. But a strategy that is dependent almost, I mean, really the bedrock of it is out of the lessons of I guess the second Iraq war and the US role there, insisting that our allies in Iraq, like-minded individuals involved in Syria in that conflict, will play the real role in rolling back this group. But I think a lot of us here who have kept up on this would agree that doesn't seem to be working very well. So I say all this just to sort of set the stage for our discussion. A very complicated issue, a very complicated set of forces. As was mentioned, also this growing worry that this group, the Islamic State, very savvily has attracted not just adherents in that part of the world, disaffected Sunni Muslims, but is attracting Westerners from Europe, from America, from Canada, to take up the battle with them. So, you know, I think maybe with that, we'll shift to hearing the perspective of our 2 panelists. But, you know, as someone who spent a good bit of time in the Middle East, particularly during the Iraq War. One of the things I hope we can discuss tonight is something that doesn't often get discussed, which is, or debated, which is the gospel, if you will, that the United States is the primary force to help solve this. And I'm not convinced that it is. Certainly it needs to play a part, but I'd be interested to see if we can have a little discussion about solutions. Solutions in the international community, but also potentially solutions in the region that perhaps up until now were considered completely out of the box. Because obviously a lot of what we're seeing there is the breakdown of sovereign states, what people would say are failed states, both Syria and Iraq and others. And so I hope we can have a discussion too about the way ahead on that. And with that, I think we're going to start with Tom, and then we're going to go to Shadi. Tom, do you want to start?
Sure.
I know you have a presentation.
Sure, sounds good. Thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you to everyone for joining us this evening. My name is Tom Sanderson. I'm the Director of Transnational Threats at CSIS, right next door here, which is very convenient. Thank you. And my group investigates the degree and nature of the terror threat worldwide, looks at the response to it, its crossover with criminality, and all of the other underlying factors and causes that are present. And we certainly try to take a broad view of what some of the solutions or approaches might be. And we, of course, recognize that you have to go well beyond the military to solve a problem or to treat a problem. Solving is not realistic, but to treat or respond to a problem like ISIS. I'm in the middle of two projects right now, one on foreign fighters, one on militancy across Africa's Sahel region. What I'm going to offer today is some feedback and perspective from the recent field visit I did 2 months ago to Turkey and to the Syrian border. In the conduct of offering those perspectives, I'll give some commentary on our strategy or lack of strategy, incomplete strategy, and some of the challenges in actually confronting this problem. So I'll jump right into it. I'm not going to be able to hit every single bullet that we have here, but I'll go through several of them. So let's talk about the chaos that we see across the broader region. So we'll start at the broader level, and then we'll go down to the ISIS battle space of Syria and Iraq. So of course, following the initial weeks and months of the Arab Spring, incredible exuberance. People thought they'd be turning over a new leaf, there'd be jobs, there'd be transparent government, an end to corruption. Not a chance. Huge hangover from that. The economy plays a very significant role there. Remains terrible. It's very, very difficult to get out of that. 2003, we have the US-led invasion of Iraq. The repercussions and the ripple effects from that still hitting us. In fact, responsible for a decent amount of what we have today as far as problems. There is a significant government role in the instability. We, of course, know what Maliki did with marginalizing Sunnis in his country. Assad's contributions to this are well known. President Erdogan in Turkey also making a negative contribution here. And many, many other leaders. We're dealing with corruption that's persistent, failed governance, a huge issue, and the continued marginalization of not just Sunnis, but lots of others. This is leaving an opening, okay, in governance, in social service provision, in security provision, and entering into that gap are militant groups. The regime in Damascus appears to be on the ropes. It was holding its own for several months last year, but now it's losing more and more territory. But at the same time, ISIS and the other militant groups are battling one another quite heatedly, but also attacking the Assad government and military. Less ISIS, more the other groups that are doing that. 90,000 messages a day are sent out by ISIS. That's an unbelievable advantage compared to what we can send out through the interagency team, the Strategic Counter-terrorism Communications Group at State, which is full of talented people, but they have to deal with all sorts of hurdles that ISIS does not. Refugees, I think it was raised in the opening lines here. We have half of Syria's population is either in refugee status outside the country or as IDPs, internally displaced persons, inside the country. They are not going back to their homes for many, many years, if at all. And they will, of course, breed resentment inside those camps. I've been to them. And you have a lot of people who are going to want to look for an outlet for the fate that has been dealt to them. There is a broad sense of empowerment. People overthrew governments. You had Tunisia fall, you had Libya fall, you had Egypt fall, you have Yemen that has fallen, Syria close to that. People feel they can very much take over government, that they can change the direction of their lives, but they don't have experience choosing leaders and they don't have experience in leading. But as our fixer, our local Syrian refugee helper along the border told me, we will not return to our cages. We may not know what we're doing, but we're not going back to the status quo. So let's talk about the more narrowly focused battle space and look at the recipe for the chaos. This is not an exhaustive list by any means, but certainly Assad's atrocities, the ungoverned space, of which there is more now than the day before 9/11. That's not a good sign. Maliki's extreme anti-Sunni policies, ISIS breaking the walls campaign of going to the prisons, putting a vehicle-borne IED outside the prisons, blowing up the wall, emptying hundreds of good fighters and bringing them into the Islamic State realm. Iraqi security force defections and failures. So the good guys, trained by our Army Rangers and SF, Special Forces, have joined ISIS in certain numbers. We see them on Predator and other surveillance feeds, and we see them maneuvering and operating just like U.S. Army Rangers. What are we left with? We get the bad guys in the Iraqi security forces that are lousy fighters that have just been selling commissions and positions inside the military, a corrupt military. Very brilliant approach to funding. A wide array, a great portfolio from ISIS' point of view so that they can ensure if one funding source gets hit, they expand funding in another. They've reduced the amount of funding, kept it minimal, that comes from the Persian Gulf, from the Arabian Gulf, so that there's not that leash that can be pulled by the Saudis, by the Qataris, by the Emiratis, by others who in the past have had many citizens fund these groups, among others. So they've set up a very nice locally sourced method of funding. Certainly the declaration of the Caliphate lends a sense of legitimacy and sanctity to what they're doing for those 22,000 plus young men and some women coming from over 100 countries to join their battle. Where are we here? And the incomplete anti-ISIS strategy, which we'll get into a bit, that equals the highly capable forces that were arrayed against us today. Beyond the security issue, and by that I mean the hardcore combat issue, you have incredible demographic and economic problems, huge reduction in revenues for the state of Iraq, 40% fewer oil revenues than prior to ISIS going into Mosul. That's a country that's in incredible trouble. Trying to deal with all of those problems at the same time is a terrible challenge. Part of the overall strategy of bolstering Iraqi security forces, bolstering the Peshmerga, conducting airstrikes that began last August, is to train proxy boots for us. We don't want to put our boots on the ground, so let's get moderate Syrians to do it. Well, we've trained about 88 of them. That's not a very good start. Okay, trying to vector these guys who want to take out Assad against ISIS, which is much more capable, I think is just not going to happen. And even if we're able to degrade and destroy ISIS, all of the factors that have fostered their development over the years, they didn't just appear last June. They've been there in a number of iterations, the Islamic State of Iraq, Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Those factors do not quiet. We cannot quiet the factors that led to the emergence of these groups and to the sustainment of these groups. And we're not going to see an end to Sunni jihadist violence or the response by Shia groups for a very, very long time. We won't see an end, but an evolution, in the words of my colleague, Tony Gordesman. So the field visit, just this past March and April, Istanbul, Ankara, Antep, Sanliurfa, Entrepreneur, border crossing, Suruc, Kobani, and then down into Rehanma. These are the sources that I met with. So a very young ISIS fighter, just got out 2 weeks before I met him, an ISIS logistician, smuggler, Nusra Front propagandist, and then all these other sources here, which laid out a story of what was happening on the border, which is a continued accommodation by Turkey to allow Nusra and ISIS to operate from their borders. There are allegations that the bombings that took place in Kobani today were perpetrated at least by some ISIS fighters who mounted the attack from Turkey and came over the border. So some of the findings, some of the basic findings, continued accommodation, the use of NGOs with widespread international networks funneling fighters to Turkey and Syria over the last 4 years, hospitals that are treating large numbers of the fighters. I saw the medical records of the foreign fighters, saw the video taken surreptitiously of the fighters inside the hospitals, a vision by Erdogan of groups that match up, maybe not on the same part of the spectrum of his vision for Islamist government, but certainly along the spectrum that he sits on. Chechens, I learned, play a much bigger role than I thought. I knew, of course, that Omar Shashani was the overall military commander of ISIS, but I didn't realize there were 4 separate brigades there, some from Turkey, who were Chechen refugees from the wars in the 90s in Chechnya, and others who were brought in directly from Chechnya. We've had a change in Turkish government recently, and you're likely to have non-AK party members inside the Turkish Foreign Ministry who certainly don't want to be tagged with the policy of allowing fighters to come in and out of the country, so they have tremendous incentive to reveal what has been happening, as well as for political reasons and retribution. So there's a lot of trouble coming there. So foreign fighters, one of the main issues that is part of this overall discussion. Half the world's countries are represented among the foreign fighters, mostly young men, coming with a sense of mission, purpose, all sorts of motivations bringing them there, not only to fight to establish the caliphate, but to defend it and to run it, to provide food, to provide clothing, to work in Sharia courts, to do all of the things that are required to bring this state to its feet and maintain it. The problem, of course, is that what happens when they return home with the skills, the credibility, the confidence, the networks to conduct attacks. Think about the attack in Texas just a few weeks ago at that event meant to draw people together to depict the Prophet Muhammad. And those 2 guys from Phoenix came. They tried to sneak up on the police who were providing security. The police ended up killing them. These were guys who were not hardened by battle. If those had been guys who had been in the battles inside Syria and Iraq and had gone to that same event, they would have killed those police and gone inside and killed a lot of other people. Big difference between an individual who is incited to violence but who's never been in combat compared to an individual who comes back after combat and then gets the same message to attack. A wholly different story. One of the problems as well is fighters coming out of the battlefield to the United States through the visa waiver program, being able to purchase passports from visa waiver countries. I've met with the passport trafficker on the border. My colleague Juan Zarate and I wrote an op-ed in the New York Times about this engagement, this interview with this man who has access to blank passports and can reconfigure passports on very sophisticated machinery and get people into the United States. It's not a cakewalk to do it, but nonetheless, you skip the process of interviewing at a US consulate. The 16-year-old fighter there on the left, the Nusra Front propagandist there on the right, me in the middle. This is Kobani here, and if you look at the New York Times articles today, you'll see video footage from this vantage point showing these plumes of smoke that are rising above Kobani. Here are the residents coming back in. Now, ISIS had been ejected after very intense US airstrikes and very brave fighting by YPG, the militia associated with the region. People were rebuilding, a lot of booby traps there, but nonetheless going back in. That's the crossing right there, and now they have to deal with snipers and ISIS fighters that have retaken a hospital. One of the foreign fighters here. Easy access to guns on the border, one of the gun shops I visited. The youth group of the YPG there, these are the initials, APO, of Turkey's Kurdish leader, Öcalan, and it says on the bottom there, "We are everywhere." This is the passport trafficker. I'm happy because I got the interview. He's not too happy, but it was an amazing conversation, I'll tell you, for 90 minutes. That's us meeting with Assad several years ago. It's me in the tan suit, Dr. John Altman, our Middle East chief, in the middle, one handler for Assad, and then Dr. Anthony Cordesman from CSI is the Burke Chair in Strategy. This is Palmyra, 2007, which we visited immediately after that meeting with Assad. An amazing place, absolutely beautiful. Reports in the last 48 hours that they've been exploding, destroying mausoleums associated with Shia figures. Some of the burial towers here. It is a massive, massive set of ruins. It's an absolutely remarkable place. That's the amphitheater that was unearthed just a couple of years before we got there, and ISIS executed 20 people in this amphitheater just a couple of weeks ago. And this is, I'm sure, destroyed at this point. The amphitheater again, and that's it. Okay. Over to you.
Shadi, take it away.
Great. So good to be here. Thanks to the World Affairs Council for having me. So as some of you might know, there was a previous event with Tom and myself about 8 months ago. So it's kind of interesting to kind of take stock what has changed, what hasn't. And certainly some things have changed, but in some ways we're still kind of stuck. So I think Tom outlined very well where we stand now, the state of play. What I want to do is take a step back and look a little bit conceptually, and try to offer a framework for understanding what ISIS is. I mean, how do we understand this group? And I think it's difficult to really characterize them and to understand what they're about. So I'll start with that and offer some thoughts on where we go from here. Well, first of all, there comes a point where you can't really undo the damage. And whenever I talk about ISIS, I always debate how pessimistic should I be, because I don't want to depress you guys too much, right? But I think the fact of the matter is, even if we defeated ISIS tomorrow morning, the legacy of ISIS would be with us really for decades to come, pretty much for the rest of our lives in one way or another. So from now on, anytime you have an ungoverned or ungovernable space in the Middle East, parts of Africa or Asia, the extremist group in the area is going to think to itself, well, why don't we try to establish a little mini caliphate or mini emirate in this piece of territory? And that's where ISIS has really set the standard for what extremist groups can aspire to do. And this is where ISIS is really revolutionary. This is what makes it uniquely dangerous, is that for Al-Qaeda, the idea of a caliphate was maybe an aspiration and an inspiration. But they didn't actually do a lot about it. And this was a criticism you often heard of Al-Qaeda, that they were very good at destroying things, but not very good at building anything in its place. Now, where Al-Qaeda was kind of unserious, ISIS is actually doing it. So this kind of mythical, theoretical idea of the caliphate, they actually did it. And that point is worth emphasizing because it's unprecedented, at least to this degree. This large swath of territory covering a big part of two very important countries in the Middle East, Iraq and Syria. Now, this is interesting because what does capturing and holding territory really entail? It entails governance. And this is, I think, is really worth emphasizing. And sometimes there's a tendency to talk about ISIS as if it's just a terrorist group, so savage terrorist group. But that's not the best lens with which to understand ISIS, because they take governance quite seriously. And this is at least one key of their success. Now, in the territories it controls, we have, they've been able to provide some degree of law and order. They've been able to run local administrations. They have a rather intricate and elaborate taxation system, and really elaborate governance structures more generally. And if you really kind of look at the primary source documentation and actually look at how they run ISIS and how they run their territory, this is not just a terrorist group that happens to control a piece of territory. They've given a lot of thought to what their system of governance looks like. Now, this is, I think, surprising for a lot of us on the American side of things, because when we look at a kind of messianic, apocalyptic organization, Well, we don't think that's not very conducive to the mundane realities of everyday governance. There's a real tension there. And this is oftentimes, I think, what we hear in the discourse about ISIS, almost this kind of presumption that we just give them enough time and they're going to burn themselves out naturally. And this is sometimes not explicit, but implicit in President Obama's statements when he says things like, ISIS, a group like ISIS, has no place in the 21st century. I would actually say the exact opposite, and we can get into this a little bit later in the Q&A session, but ISIS is inconceivable in any century but this one. Exact opposite, for me at least. Now, these two sides of ISIS, it's kind of apocalyptic, messianic, brutal side, because they are, even by the rather high or low standards of the Middle East, quite distinctly brutal. So that side of ISIS coexists, again, with this more mundane, let's collect taxes side of ISIS. And there is a real tension there, because the reckless abandon of apocalypticism doesn't really go well with governance. But so far, and this is, I think, is really, if you will, the surprising aspect of ISIS's success, they've been able to have these two sides, these almost this kind of schizophrenic reality of these two sides living together in uneasy tension, but so far they've been able to pull it off. Now, why does ISIS matter in the broader scope of Middle East politics? They challenge the most basic presumptions about the nature of political change in the Middle East. So if we look at the world of political Islam, the vast majority of Islamists are not actually extremists. They're what we would call mainstream Islamists. So groups like the Muslim Brotherhood, the Brotherhood, its affiliates, its descendants, groups that are inspired by the Brotherhood's model of bottom-up change. And that can include groups and parties like the AK Party in Turkey, and Nahda in Tunisia, the PJD in Morocco, the Kuwaiti Islamic Constitutional Movement, so on and so forth. And these are groups, we call them mainstream because they work within existing state structures. They participate, for the most part, in democratic politics. They believe in elections, so on and so forth. Now, I don't want to get into that too much, but why ISIS is really quite fascinating is because they're challenging two of the most basic assumptions of the Brotherhood model of change. The first one is gradualism. So the Brotherhood does slow and steady as you go. They were founded in 1928, 80 years later, long game, go slow. And also this bottom-up approach where you start with the individual, and then if the individual becomes a better Muslim, then you have better Muslim families, then you have the more pious Muslim community, then the society, then at the very end you get to the level of government. So slow, bottom-up. What ISIS has essentially been saying is, forget the gradualism. The only way the Islamic State can be achieved is through brute force. We don't wait, we do it now, as soon as possible, and with the utmost savagery imaginable. That's one. But they also challenge something else, which hasn't really been talked about as much. But generally, mainstream Islamist movements care about being liked. They care about being popular. That's why they're mainstream. These are kind of big tent movements. ISIS says essentially, we don't need to be popular at all. We can alienate the vast majority of Muslims, but we can focus on capturing a small sliver of disaffected Muslims on the far, far right of the political spectrum. And if there are 1.6 billion Muslims, you don't really need to be popular. I mean, that's a lot of people. So if you're able to carve out 0.3%, let's say, of the entire Muslim population of people who actually support ISIS and its ideology, that's actually a massive number. And it shows that you don't need to have the masses behind you to be very successful. So again, in Iraq and Syria, and I think this is illustrated quite in really stark relief by what happened in Mosul last year. So ISIS comes in to Mosul with about 900 fighters, and they're able to overtake an Iraqi security force of 30,000 or so. The same thing in Ramadi quite recently. We're talking about ISIS fighters in the low hundreds, but they're able to take a provincial capital. There's an important lesson there. And it also says something about the power of ideology. If you have a small group of ideologically committed fighters who are willing to fight and die for a cause, they can overtake much larger forces. So you have almost a built-in advantage on the battlefield. And we see this actually beyond just ISIS, but we can talk about the Houthi rebels in Yemen also. How can they overtake a US-backed government and military? But they can do that with a few thousand fighters. Okay, so where does this kind of leave us? And I'm already a little bit over time, so I'll just close up with some, maybe tee up some thoughts about where we go from here. And feel free again to push back and disagree with me on any of this. But what we essentially have here is a very striking mismatch between means and ends. So this administration says that the goal is to defeat, destroy, degrade, let's say defeat ISIS. But what we're doing doesn't actually even come close. So it's kind of unserious at the face of it. It would actually be better if we could really have a true, honest conversation. What this administration would probably say is the goal is to actually, for now, contain ISIS and manage the threat, and then maybe our means actually fit the bill. But obviously in this domestic context, you can't actually admit that you're unserious about defeating ISIS. And there's a couple of fundamental problems with our ISIS strategy. One is this kind of Iraq-first approach, which makes sense in a kind of short-term sense. But if we understand ISIS as a group that really rose to prominence in Syria, and then the spillover spilled into Iraq, the fact that we talk relatively little about Syria is really concerning. And I think this Iraq-first strategy is actually a way for us to avoid our reckoning with the Syria problem. And it also puts us at a profound disadvantage because our enemies, so whether that's ISIS or even Shia militias, they treat Iraq and Syria as a combined theater. We don't. We separate them. How can we fight an enemy if we're actually playing by a different set of rules and a different set of assumptions that don't really bear any reality with what's going on the ground? I mean, this mythical border doesn't really exist anymore, and they've kind of blended in. So what we've essentially ended up doing is we're going after short-term victories, quick wins. We're trying to rush into talking about retaking Mosul without thinking about what is really the long-term strategy in place. So what we end up doing, the more ISIS gains, the more the Iraqi government, and effectively we, rely on Shia militias. The more the Iraqi government relies on Shia militias, the more Sunni support ISIS gets. And we're stuck in this endless circular loop. So we have to ask ourselves, okay, we retake Tikrit, but that's a tainted victory. Tikrit, several months later, is still a ghost town. You've only started to have people going back in now, but Tikrit doesn't really exist as a city right now. So, but what that requires is, so when we talk about long-term strategy, we talk about things that I worry this administration, actually, it's not really about worrying anymore. Things that this administration is simply unwilling to do, especially when it comes to Syria. And Tom talked about the quite disheartening number of 88 rebels that have been trained. And I remember we were having this conversation last year. We were talking about this. And it was $500 million allotted for training 5,000 fighters. And 8 months or even a little bit more than that later, we are talking about 88 out of the 5,000. And we were complaining then that 5,000 was a drop in the bucket. So the 5,000 number was unserious. And it's 88 out of the 5,000. Anyway, there's a lot more to say on that, but let's, I'll end there and look forward to the conversation.
Well, maybe I'll ask one question, which builds off of Shadi's remarks about the way ahead. Earlier, I think you referenced a mastermind alliance that would be required not just the United States, but our key allies in the Middle East. Given what both of you just described, I wonder what are the sort of strategic level, or I don't know, massive type solutions that could be applied to a problem that seems to be, by definition, completely falling out of the sort of normal realm of international relations and diplomacy. In other words, if you're dealing with these ungoverned areas, all of those series of problems that Thomas laid out in terms of economic deprivation, lack of education, alienation, are there things the international community could conceivably do that would make a difference at all, in other words? Because obviously the international community is based around that set of assumptions about how you deal with global problems, how do you advance peace. And this is a problem that operates under completely different assumptions. And maybe the part two of that discussion is, would a stabilizing factor in that part of the world potentially be a Kurdistan? Or something in the model of normal international relations that could exert enough power over the region where it would be able to push back against this behemoth that operates completely different than we do.
Yeah.
Do you want to start on that? Or?
I'll offer very brief comments. You asked the question, can we think of things that are conceivable? By that, do you mean that are doable, reachable, or just what would they be if we had a dream list?
Well, I mean, I guess how about both? I mean,
Okay. I don't think
the
we're
dream
going-
scenario, but
Sure.
then the one that over this mid to long term
Yeah.
might have some legs.
I don't think we'll get there, and there is a place of peace or manageability and success. I just don't think we will. I think that it's too complicated of a problem, too many players, too many problems. And in America, that is not only not the solution here, but is reluctant to think of itself as the solution, at least right now. You would need political and economic inclusion, economic development, massive reduction in corruption, and Sunni Shia engagement. Okay, those things would solve the problems, but those aren't going to happen. So turn it to Shadi.
Yeah, so a couple things. I mean, first of all, the fact that we're relying on some of the most repressive regimes to fight ISIS is cause for concern in the long run. It makes sense in the short run, and here, this is where the trade-off becomes very obvious. So we have to work with really, really bad actors, whether it's Egypt, Saudi Arabia, so on, to get some progress on the ground. But if one of the root causes, if you will, of the rise of extremism is governance deficits, of lack of inclusive, accountable government, the fact that people don't feel they have a stake in the political process, then these repressive regimes are in some sense part of the problem themselves. So again, it's a circular loop that we get stuck in. But the reason that we rely so much on these repressive regimes is, I mean, the basic, not to oversimplify, but if you want to think about the Obama administration's vision for the Middle East, to some extent it's, if we step back, others will step in. Let's let others take some of the responsibility. This is very nice in theory. Let people in the region do what they should do and all that nice stuff. But that only works if you have good allies who share your interests and values. When you have, generally across the board, problematic allies, they will actually step in when you step out. But they'll step in and make it worse. Now, so let me just offer something a little bit more, that's on the conceptual level, more tangible. And, I don't want to come across to this audience as too hawkish, but, maybe we'll have to do that. So Syria. Syria is where there's a gaping hole in our strategy. Now, 5,000 fighters is clearly not enough, but even beyond that, there's a question of what you do about the Assad regime. And again, the temptation in the short run is to have some kind of de facto alliance with the Assad regime because they're the lesser evil. Again, this is a very problematic way of thinking about it, because one of the reasons that extremists have gained ground in Syria is because of the brutality of the Assad regime. And also increasingly we're finding out about how the Assad regime is either indirectly or even directly encouraging ISIS's rise in certain areas over the past 2 years. So if we're training rebels, the question is, what if they face off against the Assad regime? Are we going to let them get shot down? Are we going to let them get killed after we've trained 5,000 or 10,000 of them? And this is not just us, but also our allies. No, there has to be air support. I think looking back, the mistake was there was a time when the rebels had momentum where the U.S. could have intervened, the U.S. and its allies could have intervened militarily. But we didn't do that. We had another chance in August 2013. We backed down. In all of these cases, we failed to address the fundamental problem in Syria, which is one of the most brutal regimes of recent decades. I mean, more than 200,000 killed, the majority at the hands of the Assad regime and its allies. So I think at some point we have to revisit the conversation in Washington about U.S. military intervention, not just against ISIS, but against the Assad regime. Now, we might not like that, but there's just simply no other alternative. So we can say, look, the American people don't have the stomach for this kind of massive, large-scale intervention. That's fine. But then let's be honest with ourselves and say the goal is not, in fact, to defeat ISIS or to even improve the lives of the Syrian people or to somehow have an alternative. Because at the end of the day, you need to have a Sunni third force. You need to have a Sunni alternative. And there isn't going to be a Sunni alternative in Syria unless someone is willing to carve out, you call it a safe zone, no drive zone, no fly zone, humanitarian corridor, unless they actually have a place where they can be safe and secure to build an alternative to show to the Syrian people, then forget about it.
Let's go to questions.
I was curious to know, once visiting Syria, if you saw any accommodation for minority populations, such as the Armenians, who are unable to travel to other adjacent countries because of historical kind of killings, obviously, because Turkey, Azerbaijan, Iraq, and Armenia obviously can't economically sustain the migration. So that's my first question, if you saw an accommodation. And the second question would be, do you foresee the United States participating in a safe haven or an area for specifically Christian minorities, such as the Armenians, because of their inability to migrate?
To answer your first question, I was there in 2007, and we were not exposed to any minority group in that way where we would have questioned them, and we were there for a different purpose. The most recent visit, I was not inside Syria, I was at the border, and there were certainly all types of minorities milling about the border, but no, again, I didn't go there to look at that. I know you don't think I did, but I didn't, get a sense of how things were going for the Armenians. And again, if we choose the Armenians, then quite likely Turkey will be upset with that, or the Kurds or the Yazidis or another group will say, why aren't we getting the same protection? Excuse me, and protecting them would entail very likely the use of U.S. air power to create a safe haven around them. Now, Turkey wants a safe haven all along its border for all sorts of issues, and we are the only ones that can do it, and that's what they're trying to get us to do. That's not going to happen. It's a massive expenditure. It's full of all sorts of political pitfalls. So to isolate a group like the Armenians it's not going to happen.
It seems to me that there's a policy subterfuge with regard to how to treat ISIS. The general public is primarily interested in knowing or learning or just solving the ISIS problem. And yet, it almost seems that we inevitably, in these discussions and elsewhere, point to ISIS to reflect the impossibility of the pre-existing strategy that was in effect, the balance of power, the status quo, the nefarious, evil tyrannies that have ruled the region for whatever period of time you want to point to. And yet we point to the impossibility of that very same structure as a means of solving ISIS and defeating it permanently. And so I guess the question is as follows. What are, in light of these linkages and costs and analytical sort of networks and cobwebs of interrelated interests, what are the actual interests that either of you, maybe perhaps both of you, would recommend ought to be sacrificed and at which altar to defeat ISIS or to more permanently re-engineer the region in a more sustainable fashion.
I would not personally use the word sacrifice because sacrifice is quite pejorative. So the things that, but I do accept the premise that that there are trade-offs depending on what you prioritize. So if you prioritize Syria, then something else might be undermined. We don't know to what degree or what that will look like, but you can't have it all. And I think sometimes our approach to policy in the Middle East, we're so afraid of losses and all, even relatively minor losses all throughout the region that it paralyzes us. And we're unable, again, to really articulate a vision. If you want to articulate a bold vision, you're going to anger someone. You have to choose who's worth angering. I think that we should be quite willing to anger the Egyptian regime more than we anger them, or the Saudis, or our allies. And I mean, Israel's another problematic ally that does things that undermine the U.S. position in the region. But we have to decide what, it's about balancing. And this is where there is real debate. When I meet with people in the U.S., in the government, in this administration, we disagree on some of the starting assumptions. What are our core interests? And this gets back to one of the earlier questions. We could, if the core interest is just protecting the American homeland, that's it. That's what we're about. That's the responsibility of elected politicians, and that's it. That's a different way of looking at our core interests. So I think, when we have these conversations, we have to give more thought to what are we actually talking about here? What's important to us as Americans?
I guess my question is, what should we be doing that we can do tomorrow if you're President Obama? Name one or two things that you would do differently than we're doing now that would at least try to move things in a direction where you're unpacking some of the forces that are feeding us.
I don't know if there's something that you can do. I mean, if you could wave a magic wand and make something happen, it would be economic development and equality. Giving people jobs, purpose, money, a stake in the future would do it. The problem is, it's not going to happen.
Correct.
Okay, so if you had a magic wand and could bring up the Human Development Index level, and you look at the Arab Development Report, you look at all these things, if you were able to raise the living standards of all these people and give them good governance, that's what would work. It would cover so many of the problems. Again, not happening.
What I'm arguing for is different fundamentally in some ways than what people were talking about in 2003. There are limits to interventionism. We have learned lessons, or we should have learned lessons. I would not advocate, for example, boots on the ground in Iraq in any kind of critical mass sense. You can have kind of advisors on the front line and things like that, which we're already doing. But I would never advocate and have never advocated something comparable to the Iraq invasion.
But you're advocating toppling Assad.
Yeah.
I mean, that's not that easy.
It isn't. Well, first of all,
And the
goal,
consequences are hard to predict.
the goal isn't toppling Assad. The goal, the goal ultimately is you hope to put enough pressure on Assad. There has to be a credible threat of military force, so he has an incentive to go to the negotiating table in good faith. Now, toppling him and just destroying the regime, first of all, as you say, it's not realistic. It's problematic to, you'd want to protect some kind of state structure. But the argument, this is also a problem when people kind of have criticized my approach. They've said, well, you just want to get rid of Assad. In fact, if we look at, say, Bosnia or Kosovo, the goal wasn't toppling Milosevic. That ultimately happened, but the goal at first was to get him to the negotiating table. And that's exactly what happened, and we had, and those were the agreements that were worked out, and Milosevic did stay in power for a period of time. So I just want to move away from this straw man that anyone who's calling for military intervention is calling for this maximalist toppling governments thing. I would actually argue that military intervention and diplomacy go hand in hand. And one reason why diplomacy has failed in Syria is because there hasn't been a credible threat of military force. So that's one thing, and just to give you something more practical, I think I did kind of offer things that maybe they're not, we can't envision this administration doing them, but they are actually things that the US could do if there was sufficient political will. And I would hope that, let's say there's a Clinton administration in a year and a half, this is something that I hope will be on the table. Safe zones, air support for the Syrian opposition, a real effort to train not just 5,000, something well over 5,000 fighters, but also to have a real plan. How do you integrate them into existing rebel forces? You don't want to just have a new force that you put off to the side. You have to think about where they fit into the existing rebel theater. So there are things that can be done. Again, they will be very controversial.
But if you have failed states that come up behind this, doesn't that just get you where you were in 2003? Where you've done all this, you've trained all these people. I mean, I was there when we spent, I thought, $25 billion training the Iraqis. For what? I mean, the structure wasn't there to sustain it.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is a conversation that I hope has given you all some opportunity to think about things can start out quite simply, as complex things can do. We haven't had many solutions offered tonight. That's only because this problem is not going to get smaller. It's going to get bigger. And I'm from Ireland, and I'm a pragmatic optimist. The other thing I'd like to do is to thank Brian, Shadi, and Tom for their candor in terms of talking not only from their hearts, but from their heads about the fact that it would require a huge paradigm shift in our own culture and our own relationship with our citizens in the United States, as well as the rest of the world, for this to really have an opportunity to be resolved. Each of you are citizens. You've all got an opportunity to speak at the ballot box. And there is no separating what Tom said in terms of economic needs being met, as well as philosophical and political and governance needs being met to help resolve this situation. But it can't be done by one nation or 10 nations. This is a global issue. This really needs to be sorted out at a global level, because I think the days of the United States being the world's policeman are long gone. And I think our citizens here believe that in 2015. So there's a great power called the power of prayer. Put it into action and then interact with each other. Thank you all very much for coming tonight.
Thank you for joining us for World Affairs Today, a production of the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. Stay connected with us at www.worldaffairstoday.org.